Hi, this is Samita Nandi from the Center for Media and Celebrity Studies. Today we're featuring groundbreaking book, Incomplete, Feminist Possibilities of the Unfinished Film. We're very honored to have Alix Beeston with us, who is the editor of the book, and we also have Helen Dewberry with us. Our other panelist, Ian Dixon, should be joining us in any moment. But first, we're going to start with a screening, and please hold on to all your questions and reflections till the end of the screening and the entire talk. Those who are joining us online, please feel free to introduce yourself in the live chat, share your questions, your reflections, and we're going to address them one by one. So please bear with us, and we'll be back in a second.
I read your op-ed. Tell our podcast audience, who inspired your dance?
My mother. My mom was a performing artist. I remember her joyfully telling me how she received an offer to be a lead actress in a film, but she wasn't able to perform. Her family was very conservative. They took her off the dance stage at the age of 16.
There's still several women and men who continue to face sexism.
Yes. My ex from England slept with 22 women while he was verbally abusing me. One of my uncles took all ancestral property using fraudulent signatures so that all assets go not to me, but to his sons, one of which had me sexually play with him when I was 8. Another uncle kicked my pregnant aunt in bed. He was just violent.
I am so sorry. Statistics show that violence continues in families. Some relationships have more equality, though.
Yes. My dad supported my education and my dance. However, he passed away, just like my mom, due to cancer.
Sophia, do you have more support?
Yes. Yes. I think so.
So that was the opening scene of the film, The Critic. And a huge thanks to Christopher Michael Heisler, the cinematographer, and actress Frankie Rooney, who made this possible in Lisbon, Portugal. It's a project that has been in progress. I'll mention at the end of the talk whether it's complete or incomplete, which is the theme of today's panel. I'm so excited to celebrate the book, Incomplete, Feminist Possibilities of the Unfinished Film by Alix Beeston, and really thankful to our panelists who are here with us today. And before we get on to questions and reflections, I would love everybody to introduce themselves. Please introduce yourself. Let us know your name, which city you're logging in from, and anything else you want to share. We'll start with Alix, who's the editor of the book.
Yes, hi everybody. It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Samita, for organising this event. Thanks to Helen and hopefully Ian as well for joining us. My name is Dr. Alix Beeston. I'm based at Cardiff University in Wales, but I'm Australian by origin. And I'm one of the co-editors of this book. I've got a copy of it here. My pride and joy. I co-edited this book with my friend and collaborator, Stefan Soloman, who's based at Macquarie University in Sydney, just a fabulous film and media scholar. And it features 14 artists, practitioners and scholars thinking through the unfinished. So it's definitely a collaborative effort. So I'm coming here from Cardiff today and I'm really excited to be here. Thank you, Samita.
It's a pleasure to have you with us, Alix. Helen?
Hi, I'm Helen Dewberry. I'm in England. And my interest, I suppose, is in film and poetry. And in particular, the telling of stories is important to me, and the ability for people to tell their own stories without it being co-opted or contradicted by louder voices. I think that's really important. It's great to be here today, and thank you for inviting me to join the panel.
Thank you, Helen, for being with us. So I'm sure we have a lot of thoughts on the book as we celebrate Alix. I remember when the publication was released last year, and at that time I was flying and I really wanted to join the book launch live, but because I was flying, I requested for a recorded version of your launch last year. And as I was flying, I was watching the recorded version, and I was filled with so much pride and hope, and I was just so happy. And I'm reading the book, and I really love how you use a feminist perspective to shed light on all films. And in my understanding, from my own practice and research, the film industry is structured in a very class-based, ableist, patriarchal setting. And as a feminist practitioner, I do have experiences of working in that very systematic structure of inequality. I love the book cover, Alix, but first of all, I wanted to ask you, what inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, thanks, Amita. I'm really pleased that a sense of joy kind of comes through your sense of the book. That's really, that was a significant aspect of this project. So just briefly to say, like, we worked on this mostly through COVID. So we kind of had the idea for the project before COVID hit. And then the bulk of the work happened throughout that period of real cataclysmic disaster, so much suffering around the world, such uneven sense of kind of experience, some people too cooped up, other people too isolated, and for me personally, it was a real lifeline during the pandemic. I think working alongside others was a very powerful reminder of the importance of the work that we are doing in the arts and the humanities, even in the midst of these really terrible crises in the world. And so I think it's really wonderful that a sense of that sort of togetherness and joy and collective energy is conveyed through the project. But yeah, so I think this book came about through a confluence of shared interests between myself and Stefan Soloman, my collaborator. I've been interested in the unfinished for a long time, and I remain completely obsessed with the unfinished. And so this is part of my evangelizing about the unfinished, all its permutations, and particularly the feminist incomplete. But I had done some work on unproduced screenplays in my PhD research, actually, and had realized that these are really interesting and relatively untapped resources for study. And it struck me that there was more that we could do with these materials, exactly to sort of reveal the kinds of differentials of access and opportunity that you describe, these structures of inequality that shape all types of artistic practice, but in particular ways, film practice, right? Because almost all film is highly interdependent. It's like quite expensive. It requires quite a large amount of resources, diverse forms of expertise. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and there's a lot of ways that the wider structures of inequality and in lack of access can shape those processes too. So I was thinking along these lines, and then Stefan, my friend, was interested in what he was calling at the time durational film. So films that are made not over months or even years, but in decades in some cases, or films that are closed but then reopened, for instance. And so we were just chatting about this actually, and we sort of thought there's something interesting here. Let's kind of pursue this. And then ironically, this felt like a project that wanted to be finished. Everything sort of went right with it, to be honest, even in the midst of COVID. And I think just the whole I think we felt a sense of real energy and purpose that came from, talking with lots of other people, asking people to contribute and having other people say, yes, there's something really interesting here. There's something new here that might have the potential to change not only how we do feminist film and media studies, although I think it does have that potential, even how to change the way we think about the film object, how we think about creative process, and indeed how artists and practitioners think about their own unfinished works. That's been a really powerful part of the project, and scholars as well. I'm sure everyone listening here, I'm sure everyone on this panel has kind of unfinished projects sitting in the bottom of a drawer or in forgotten folders that accrue a lot of often negative feelings, don't they, of kind of disappointment, frustration, sometimes even shame. And so to sort of think, are there other ways we can approach these works as just a normal part of creative practice, or in all its kind of permutations?
Yeah. What I really love is how you see the unfinished film object as a process. It's like an aesthetic and political strategy to see the process as opposed to the end product, and you
Yes.
value open-endedness. I really love a couple of paragraphs, that you have so well explained, and I think it's so needed. Helen, how do you feel reading the book?
Yeah. Before I answer that, can I just ask Alix a question?
Yes.
Just on the sort of start of the book during the pandemic. I'm interested because that seems quite important that it started during the pandemic, because it was a time for, well, it meant different things to different people, but for many of us, it was a time to start something that we wouldn't have had time for otherwise. And I just wondered if the book is different because it started then.
Yes. Yes, the answer is yes, it is. I mean, part of the book actually is about thinking more seriously about the conditions of production, and the way that all artistic work or scholarly work equally, I think studying the unfinished for all of us as scholars required us to be much more self-reflexive about the conditions of the labor that we were doing, because I think it requires that of us, it opens onto these conditions. But I think everything is a kind of result of the conditions that produce it, that constrain it. And so there are actually some positive aspects of the pandemic in that regard. Now, I'm not someone, I think the pandemic was a nightmare. And I don't hold a lot of truck with people who are like, oh, actually, I got to hang out in my garden. I'm like, well, that's nice, but like heaps of people die. So anyway, but nonetheless, there were interesting affordances of the sort of crisis that we were ongoing. Like, for instance, a really practical example is that we were wanting it to be a really genuine collaboration. That was kind of something that we wanted from the very beginning, that we knew that Stefan and I knew that we couldn't do the project we imagined only by ourselves, and that we needed the really diverse expertise. We needed practitioners on board, and we believe that you can do different things together than you can do apart, and better things often. But so being separated because of lockdowns and like travel restrictions and that kind of thing, and the way that gave impetus to the use of Zoom, for instance, which I'd basically never used before the pandemic, meant that we had the idea to do work in progress sessions on Zoom. And so everybody would read an early version of our introduction, then we'd all come together and talk about it from our different corners of the world. And then I had this wonderful experience. I have a chapter in the book that's in the last section of the book, alongside two of my favorite scholars, Karen Redrobe and Catherine Fusco, and I just could not admire them more. And at one point, the three of us sat down, having each read our drafts of our chapters, to talk about how they related to one another, how they changed the way we thought about our own chapters. It was extremely productive. And I think that's part of why I hope that you can tell with the book that it is a real conversation among the participants in the project. Another really cool example of this that I think of is the work that I was doing on a Black American filmmaker and writer, Kathleen Collins, and her unproduced screenplays. Originally, I'd planned to go to the archive, which is based in New York, to go and have a look at all these materials which aren't available broadly outside outside of the archive. But because of the pandemic, I couldn't go. Thankfully, the archivists, who are angels, were still, digitizing select materials. So you could ask for one folder each month and it would be emailed to you like a love letter in your inbox, But it was a really important decision. Like if you made a mistake and you asked for the wrong folder, or the folder didn't have what you thought it had in it, then you'd have to wait another month for the next one. But what happened was that I thought I actually can't get into these materials in the way that I need to be able to write this chapter, but I need to write the chapter. And so it kind of made me think I basically reached out to all of Kathleen Collins's, well, not all of them, but a bunch of her collaborators, her daughter, her friends, anyone I could talk to get a better sense of essentially the oral histories of the work that she was doing towards these unfinished projects. And that has transformed not only the work I did for the book, but also the way I approach the study of the unfinished in general. There's a number of other scholars in the book who are very expert in using oral history research in their scholarship. I was not one of those. And so this was a really amazing opportunity for me to learn a complete new methodology, essentially. But now I can't imagine how I could have ever done the chapter without it. And again, I used Zoom to do that. So it was possible to meet with people in the States, all over the world, from my tiny little, spare bedroom / office during the pandemic. So, and actually a very special experience of how the incomplete can bring people together across unlikely circumstances. Thanks for your question, Helen.
Thank you. Yeah, that is interesting. That just come across. So I've also become obsessed with the idea of incompleteness.
Yes, we're winning.
You are, yeah. And I love the expansion of the idea of incompletion, and think it's so reflective and draws parallels with the lives of, with everyday lives, particularly of marginalized people. And if I can refer back to the film that we've just seen, the kind of processes of violence and sexual violence that are ongoing, lifelong. They don't stop with one complete, neat storyline. It's like, and another thing, and another thing, and it's never finished. In that sense, it's kind of unfinishable. It's okay to disclose one thing, but not to keep going on, which I thought in the film almost became comedic with its repetition. With the interviewer, you could see desperately trying to latch on, certainly at the beginning, onto something positive to move the conversation back to what she thought it might be in the first place. And it felt like watching a silent black and white movie. It was so graphic in its articulation. And the impacts of trauma are lifelong. And I think that was brilliantly portrayed in the film. And so I'm really grateful for the book in reframing not just film, but the way we see and experience stories around us, the telling of our own stories. In some ways, it takes pressure off. So you could say the missing movies of women's lives, in which the retelling is by its nature fragmentary and disconnected. So yeah, loved it.
I think just to jump in, I think there's certain types of stories, or as you say, voices that kind of need different forms, And I mean, this is the history of feminist filmmaking, really. Is finding new forms for telling different kinds of stories. There's more to it than that, but not less, And I think you're right. Trauma is one thing where it's the kind of structure of ongoingness and of reverberating effects that requires different modes, different ways of telling. And I think that's where some of the really more surprising findings of our scholarship was that feminist filmmakers had actively cultivated forms of unfinishedness as a resource, an aesthetic resource, a political project, trying to denaturalize our sense of the art object or denaturalize our sense of the world, or of people's experience in it. And so I think you're right that there's these kind of real valences of the unfinished that really work against a sort of very straightforward narrative arc of, beginning, middle, end, that kind of thing. And equally, I think we could think about the capitalist implications of that as well, and the imperative to finish, the imperative to be productive, and trying to work against that as well, and to say that actually art doesn't work in that economy. And I think that's often what some of the filmmakers we were looking at, even if some of them were really driven to make films and wanted their films to be completed. And I'm sure I'd love to hear a little bit more from Samita about her feelings when she's in a project and the kind of like drive to complete it. But a way of thinking about that is not the only horizon for filmmaking practice, and completion as not being the only thing that affords value to creative practice as well. Samita, would you tell us a little bit about how it feels to be in the midst of a project, and what kinds of hopes and anxieties that brings?
Yeah, thank you, Alix. And also thank you, Helen, for your thoughts on the clip. This clip is definitely a symbol of an unfinished project, but in itself, it's so powerful. It's so abrupt. It's so direct. Those who write screenplays for feature films, they feel that, well, we need some very subtle, nuanced, layers of expression, sort of, you know, unfolding this particular scene. And at the time of the production, I didn't think of it as a feature film. I was just thinking that, okay, something to build up to a short film that I was creating with my colleagues in Lisbon, Portugal, which is where I'm going to fly back again in the new year to do more scene work. And I feel that this particular scene, it says what it really needs to say, like nothing less, nothing more, without any other, theatricality. It is based on a published op-ed. So part of the story is actually totally factual. And the rest is fictionalized because I wanted to actually I wanted to reverse certain social conditions that creates limits, that actually violates certain rights that are invasive. So in that sense, it was necessary to create a fiction. Now, when I was putting together all the footage, then I felt it was close to 40 minutes. It's very close to a feature film. And I do have a lot of untold stories to tell, not only from my side, but also as an applied sociologist, observing a lot of inequalities. I feel there's a lot to tell. So that's my main motivation to bring it to feature length, because there's so much to say. But Alix, there is a lot of anxiety, and they're very short-lived, because I think now as a filmmaker, as a performer, I can adapt to situations very, very quickly. But some of the shocks that I received, like even in creating this film, my team member who was supposed to do the whole editing, I believe he received a bigger project, and my way to support him in supporting me was to take up the editing. And so when I realized that I will have to take the responsibility of editing, I was in shock. And because it's a huge learning curve, and it meant that I will have to put a very long-term hold on everything that I have been doing. So up until the pandemic, we had a very long, successful conference series. We had many publications. But when I realized that I will have to edit, it was a huge shock. And I took one day at a time. I think, just to answer your question, Alix, I think that's how I adapt and I cope. I take one day at a time. I also celebrate every single milestone. And so that celebration is very, very important. And I'm always in touch with my colleagues and my friends who are part of this process. And I'm always celebrating the memories and not just the end product. And I still don't know if it's going to be really, really finished in terms of what a feature film is expected to be. I feel from an aesthetic point of view, it will always be unfinished simply for the fact that now I am drawing on a lot of personal archives that I have on my smartphone. And I love the way it's turning out. The process is very meditative. But yeah, it is very shocking sometimes, when it comes to working with other people.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about in terms of like shock and absorption or something, like the way you have to process the kind of unexpected twists and turns, or like, yeah. And I guess come to terms with different kinds of time scales that you don't necessarily expect, where you have to just go with it in a way, and just know that the fallow periods or those seasons where there's less forward momentum that's obvious as forward momentum is still part of the process, I guess, as well. But I think the way that you take solace in sort of the memories of the work you've done, the fact of the work you've done, the fact of working with others is very powerful.
Yeah, I really like the co-creative spirit, and some way I'm very blessed to have the film space that I have in Lisbon, Portugal. Again, there was that magic number of 6 to 7 years. It took that long to be with the group of friends that I have there, and we're all co-creating. And it's for the first time in my life that I saw that, as opposed to Hollywood or Bollywood, in which I have different lived experiences, this is the only place that I saw where none of us are putting in our creative labor for any fame or any money. Some of them, they're so talented, they don't even have a social media account. And I feel I learned so much from them, from how they observe, how they tell the story. And it's just very human. So I'm just very blessed to discover that and to work with them. And they're very progressive and very interdisciplinary too.
I've
Yeah,
been
sorry.
sorry.
You go.
I think it's relevant here, but I've been thinking recently about John Keats' idea of negative capability, the dwelling in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts. I think he said, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And I think that provides a framework for art, but actually is quite freeing, and it doesn't require a completion or even an understanding of what's happening. It really seems to me to focus on the process as much as anything that might come of that process, finished or not, that we can pass on.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, Helen, in the case of the work that my collaborators and I have been doing, that especially thinking about film history in a way that gives space for uncertainty, for doubt, as you say, and for not knowing, and not trying to sort of close down. Well, firstly, not trying to give a false sense of coherence to the past, and recognizing the way these narratives of progress and actually completion, they shape the way we think about history as well. But they're kind of they're things we apply to the past, really, and largely we do so because it makes us feel better. Like, it sort of gives us a sense of our place in the world more than actually helping us to understand history. And so that was a really important thing for us, and something we felt that studying the unfinished helped us to do, actually, and required us to do, which was to leave a sense of latitude about the claims that we were making, and partly because there's a lot of speculation that's required with the unfinished, because the archive is often very fragmentary and you can only get at what you can get at, but I think that's actually been a really common thing within feminist film history in general, and something that has been important for film scholars to figure out methodologies for dealing with uncertainty, loss, failure, those kinds of things as well, but of not knowing, and of still trying to know even when you know that you're not going to know, and of holding a little bit more loosely to that pursuit of knowledge as well, which, as you say, I think is absolutely essential to the creative process as well. But I see that as being important in scholarship too. And I guess just to pick up on what you were saying about, initially starting your project and not knowing what form it would take. I mean, I think this is much more common than we actually, because we have these retrospective narratives that we apply to projects, and we all do it, right? Like you're trying to get a grant application out. So you need to make everything feel like it was all very deliberate and strategic and, and that's more about how we're processing the past than it is about what happened in the past. And often the creative process or the scholarly process is about finding a form, and it's not predetermined, I think. And in fact, I think good work is the work that finds the right form. And so it's interesting. I like the way you're thinking about the feature film as something that was one iteration of how this project could have gone, and that may not end up fitting into the norms of feature production because they're actually quite narrow in lots of ways. Yeah. And so I think that's actually more in keeping with what like creative work and scholarly work looks like in reality as well as it's unfolding.
Yeah, and even when I was working on this project as a short film, the way it was shot, it was completely reverse engineered. It started from the end and it kept unfolding back to the initial scenes. And the opening scene that we saw was actually the last scene that we shot. Wow. And I think there's a lot of value in having creative agency and just to have your own voice and to work with what the process requires and not what other spectators are expecting. Like I think like when we grow up watching films, we feel everything is linear and like they're in a chronological format. It's linear and it's all coherent. But I believe in an art philosophy that really helps, and that is art reflects life. So design life in a way that organically, authentically reflects back into the art. And that philosophy, there are a lot of philosophers, art philosophers who take similar standpoints and they illustrate more. But I felt that was very grounding, and I just took life material and life process and to justify what needed to be done. We have a question from Sultan, and she's from Film and Star Studies on X, and she asks, is incompleteness also the process of realization and gaining power, pushing forward us in some way? Alix, what are your thoughts on Sultan's question?
Thank you, Sultan. Yeah, so in the case of the book, we take a very capacious view of what we mean by incompletion, which is partly because we want to basically provide proof of concept, to say, actually, we haven't studied these incomplete objects enough, and they have particularly powerful applications for those of us who want to think in new ways about film history and film process and want to kind of create scholarship that is anchored in sort of more equal ways of being in the world. So a kind of feminist perspective that says actually the world is deeply unequal, deeply unjust, and deeply violent, and that we need to acknowledge that and also find ways to work against it. And so because we wanted to sort of give that kind of programmatic sense and sort of to inspire hopefully other people, both practitioners and scholars, to take up this work, we approach it as anything from like the idea of a film that's like scribbled on a napkin or shared in conversation, all the way through to film rushes that have been made that have been maybe partially cut together. Even in some cases, I think you could think of the rubric of incompletion around, say, works that have been completely made but then censored or shelved for various reasons. Or we even talk about incompletion in terms of spectatorship and scholarship. So the ongoing process of feminist film history on the one hand, but also the way that films in particular are sort of always these unfinished, unfolding objects that actually are realized in the minds and kind of eyes of viewers, in the cinema space or on your laptop or whatever. And this kind of sense as well of how they continue to unspool in your memory after you watch the film. That's something Maya Deren says about film, the great film theorist, that films unspool in your mind after you watch them. So in that sense, we take a very capacious view, but our emphasis absolutely is on this question of process. As Samita said at the start, process over product, and trying to revalue process over product in order to give a actually more accurate sense of how films have actually been made in the past or unmade, what circumstances have made the difference, what kinds of cultures and contexts have shaped who can make films under what conditions, but also what counts as film labor. And for us, we feel like a more capacious sense of film as process is a way of actually recognizing the way women have always been involved in film production at all levels, in all places, and have often been extremely, as Samita says, very adaptable and resilient in their kind of drive to make films against all odds. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, that was very enlightening, and thank you, Sultan, for the question. Diana has a couple of comments. Creative projects are what they are supposed to be. Part of the creative genius is that it is inspired work and exists because it resonates deep from within. Diana is finishing her PhD in Austin. I believe it's in Dallas, and her specialty is also arts and education. So thank you. Thank you. And she also adds here, I agree, it is not predetermined, it is inspired. So I think when we see art projects from the point of view of life and, where it is in life, that of course really helps. And Alix, I think you mentioned in your book that, this allows us, the incompleteness allows us to view past in the present, and also the present as a way to envision the future, a new future. And you do talk about different ways of curating, archiving, and just, very alternative ways of distribution. I had a question for you, Alix. Do you feel that short films, short film festivals, particularly, would they benefit a lot from your book? I believe, but I wanted to hear from you.
Well, I'd like to hear what you think as well, Samita. But yeah, I think one of the sub arguments, I suppose, of the book, or one of the things we're interested in, is basically essentially hierarchies of value within how we think about film, whether you're film practitioners or whether you're film scholars and thinking about film history. So there's a hierarchy of value between the finished is seen as the most value and the unfinished is seen as the least, right? But there's another sliding scale, which is also where the feature film is the kind of preeminent object, the one that we think of as the main achievement of a filmmaker. Again, but that's shaped by these logics of completion, isn't it? And this particular idea of what it means to complete a film and then have it be sent out into the world and so on. And so actually different genres of films that don't fit into that, which have often been the kinds of forms, not always, but a lot of the time, the kind of forms that are more accessible to women and other marginalized people, because, short films or homemade films or whatever it is, small gauge films, for instance, these forms that are often actually not seen as the core business of film production, certainly in mainstream film, they're often more accessible to people who don't have as many resources or who are blocked from making longer films. So there's, I think, a politics to these different ideas we have about the relative value of certain types of film objects versus others. And I really like your sense of I think even the way you've talked about it's the first scene of a film, but it also is coherent in itself, it kind of stands alone. And I think that's really interesting to think about what the place of that would be in a short film festival, for instance, on what could a short film festival could have a whole stream that are these fragments of larger films that are also allowed to have space within those kinds of institutional contexts.
Yeah.
But is that the thing you're thinking of, or?
I do sponsor a film festival that is inclusive of all artworks, and I have included works in progress, but I never articulated incomplete film objects. So I think I am inspired now to include that, just as a part of of inclusion and access and just the diversity of films. I personally believe that short films are complete in themselves, and any film object that tells a story, as long as there's a story, that's the most important thing. And one of our board members, she's a PhD from the University of Toronto, and her field was political science, and she does a lot of activism, and she believes in just having the story. The story is the most important thing. It doesn't matter what length it is. I mean, today, if I decided to just complete the film, all I have to do is, add the credits, and it'll be around 40 minutes. And it's neither short, it's neither long. It is what it is. It would be a very radical step to take, and, very positively think of it as unfinished, but as a story, it is complete. I do believe that the short film industry, if I may call it an industry, I know for Hollywood feature filmmakers, it may not feel the same, but I feel that the short film festivals, the industry dealing with short films, and nonprofit organizations will highly benefit from your book. So I really, really hope that your book, Alix, continues its dialogue, because there is such a bright future, and I already feel the community of scholars and practitioners through your book. It is living, it is breathing, as lively as your book is.
It's beautiful. Thank you so much, Samita. I do want to just clarify, I absolutely think, of course, that I'm not against finishing or finality in any, and I obviously think that short films have their own integrity as artistic objects, for sure. I think I was just reflecting on these larger questions of value and the different kind of forms that are kind of differently appreciated or institutionalized or recognized, if you know what I mean. And that I think there's ways that we can productively exhibit works in progress. I suppose that's kind of what I'm getting at. And in fact, Stefan and I did co-curate a film festival in Cardiff in 2022, which is at
Okay.
Chapter Arts Centre. Yeah, I actually have copies. If anyone is listening and they want to send me a quick email, I have copies of the program, the beautiful kind of print program that we developed with lots of essays. I'm happy to send people for free. That's fine. And I think I've got a copy as well online that I can link you to. Maybe Samita, you could share it after this event. But yeah, that was a really exciting event, partly because of trying to think through what kinds of objects are just exhibitable, and we also showed some technically complete films that do engage with unfinished objects. So, for instance, Sandy Tan's Shirkers we showed, which is the subject of one of the chapters in the book, which I'm sure some people know about. It's a major Netflix documentary about an earlier unfinished work, and it's absolutely incredible film. So we showed some works like that are technically finished. Another film actually that people might be interested in checking out has just come out on Mubi. It's called My First Film by Zia Anger.
Oh, yes. I remember, yes, that one.
Yeah, and I have a piece about this coming out in public books next month. It's a really interesting film, and I was thinking about the way you were talking about exhibition spaces and what's appropriate to show and what's not. And I think one cool thing that people like Zia Anger are doing, and other artists as well, is they're doing kind of lecture performances that engage with their unfinished projects, contextualize them, display them in a really cool way. And so that's where My First Film by Zia Anger is not really her first film. That's the kind of joke of the title. It's about an earlier unfinished feature film that she made that just didn't get distribution. So it's completely made, but then was never shown. And the film is this sort of meta fictional rendition of that making process and a reflection on the unfinished. But originally it was a lecture performance, initially in person, and then when the pandemic hit, it was an online lecture performance. It was a very, very interesting kind of desktop performance that then finds its way into this feature film that's been made as well. I just think it's productive to think about these like chains of text though, and the way that they branch out into so many different possible forms, and we make all sorts of choices along the way. And then there's all these other ghost films that kind of fall by the wayside, I'm sure that's true as well, Helen, for poetry equally, right? I mean, even at the level of, the line, like how many decisions are being made at every point, and the kind of complexity of the kind of circumstances of those decisions is really interesting to me.
Because I think that the similarities between film and poetry are immense, aren't they?
Yes.
In a way they operate, what they hold, the compression and the abstraction that can be shown. And I think the expansion, yet the compression, probably is has the most decisions around it, whether it's poetry or film, or anything else, and that would. But I do think that's an interesting thing. One thing I was particularly interested in was the archive, and I read in the book that between 75% and 90% of silent movies are lost.
Yeah.
I don't know how that figure came about. In terms
because there's other ways of knowing about films that exist rather than just through what exists as kind of reels. So, you know, that's been worked out basically through, like, you know, film magazines or like industry notices or other archival evidence of films being shown in cinemas, being seen, but then that don't exist as far as we know, or that are as yet undiscovered.
Yeah. I love the idea of the kind of reimagined of the archives and the reimagining of oral histories that may or may not be in the archive, because they might still be live, just passed on in that way. And the whole idea of how generative that could be, in so many ways, but including film. And even to the point where the teller is no longer visible, so they may not be here, or they might be, and I think, to me, that's like, we tell stories, we tell stories of things that we've heard, of what we've experienced. That might be in film, that might not be in a film, but it's often to, we don't tell it just for ourselves, but to assist others. So we might speak out in a Me Too moment, but we're not really speaking out for ourselves, but to add our voice to another's. I suppose that has some relationship to the importance of the archive.
Yeah, I mean, the archives is very important to us, and thinking about the, like, constitutive unfinishedness of the archive, like both in positive and negative senses. Like, you cannot save everything, and there's a kind of politics, obviously, to preservation, which often has played into the hands of state power or male power or whatever. But there's other ways of thinking about this, as well as being about curation, about like preserving what's valuable in a culture too. But in a very practical sense, like, as you say, especially in the era of silent cinema, which was the era in which, at least in the Western world, in which women were the most involved in film production, that's also the period in which we have the scantest archival evidence. So what do you do with that? And I think the answer that what a lot of scholars, feminist film scholars, have kind of said is, you can either go with the status quo, and you can work with what we have, knowing that it plays out all of these really problematic kind of ideas about whose work is valuable and whose isn't. Or you can find more speculative ways to approach the archive that can use what is available to try to imagine what isn't, and in order to, as a political project, right, in order to actually accurately represent the ways that women and other marginalized people have contributed to film production, film cultures, and, as you say, to kind of have their voices included in the historical record, even when the historical record has been founded in lots of ways to kind of exclude those voices, that there are ways of reading against the grain of the archive. And to some extent, it will involve a certain kind of risky business of speculation. But what's your choice? You either ignore it and you pretend it wasn't a real thing, or you speculate. They're your two options, basically. And I'm very compelled by that, I think. Yeah, but you're absolutely right that that's kind of, there's a question of witness that is related to the archive, and that I think that the unfinished gives us a particular vantage on, or just a new way of thinking about.
Thank you, Helen. Diana says Helen makes a beautiful point about uplifting others. And she also adds here, Alix conveys how often the masculine point of view tries to override or downplay the feminine point of view to promote their own perspective or narrative. And historically, that's how the film industry and also film stardom and the whole, consumption of the understandings of that stardom, mobilizing the film industry in a very patriarchal setting has been there forever. So I'm really excited to hear about the archives. And I had a question, Alix. Do you feel film festivals and nonprofit organizations, other than archives, have the capacity to also restore and curate interrupted films or lost objects in an innovative way?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. And I think one thing that's interesting, though, is so because we have such strong ideas about the value of completion over incompletion, that has shaped what has been archived. And equally, we have ideas about whose labor is valuable, right? Which is what we've been talking about, that there's certain types of people whose work is not as valuable as other types of people. I don't think that'll be unfamiliar to anyone listening, but that those are related as well. So that it's not just that it affects what gets archived or what gets kept. It's also that even who gets to finish a film is affected by those kind of valuations, if that makes sense. And so this is why it's so political to go to that unfinished, I think.
Yeah.
Is to say, actually, even if it didn't eventuate as a feature film, even if there were all these roadblocks and sort of systemic barriers in place, or even just simply more relational, circumstantial things that got in the way of something becoming to completion, that we can still think about it as part of the work of film and of film history now and in the present, now and in the past, sorry. So I think what's interesting too is that if you are wanting to work with unfinished materials as a film practitioner or a scholar, often it will require you to find, you can't really go to conventional archives in every instance, I mean, for me, practically, I couldn't go because of COVID. There is an archive devoted to Kathleen Collins, who I was studying. That's only a recent acquisition, but that's wonderful that it exists. It's partial, like every archive. But even then, it's not always straightforward to have access to these kinds of spaces, even when they're in kind of institutional homes. And so you have to find other ways to get at the materials. And some of our collaborators, our contributors to the book, they talk about, Isabel Segu talks about this as the feminist requirement to create the archive, that you actually have to kind of go out of your way and go outside of those regular kind of institutions in order to find the gems that haven't been kind of protected and preserved. So for her, it's about the kind of working along, in fact, often developing really good relationships with film practitioners that you're studying, or with their, family members, if they've died already, or their collaborators, in order to be able to develop really good relationships with them of trust and of reciprocity, so that you can go into their homes, for instance, and have a look at the materials that they've kept from their beloved parent or their friend, that kind of thing, So I think it's interesting to think through then what institutions can do differently. And you're right, whether they're smaller institutions or larger ones. And often it is the case that scholars who are trying to do this kind of really important recovery work around certain women practitioners or artists in the past often have to try to leverage relationships with these larger institutions, because it's just actually expensive and resource heavy to kind of actually archive and preserve film objects in particular. I mean, so I think that is part of it as well. But even, what you said before, Samita, about the way that film festivals, for instance, could provide spaces for work in progress and demystify the processes of film production and sort of denaturalize or pull away from this emphasis on the complete. I think that kind of change attitudinally will shift how like archives think about what is important to archive, what's important to preserve as well. And I also think like digitization, although not a cure-all and quite complicated in its effects, is also an interesting way for us to think differently about the archive too, and offers some particular opportunities there as well.
Yeah, I do see a slow progression in the shift happening. And I know a lot of the independent filmmakers who submit their work to our film festival. They really appreciate when it is broadcasted, when there's a live conversation. And after that, it is archived because simply for the fact that not all viewers are able to join in a certain time zone, so they can access later on. However, because of the politics of the film industry, a lot of filmmakers are submitting to bigger film festivals where they make exclusivity a criteria. And so there are a lot of festivals, like I believe Tribeca is one of them. So when you submit to those film festivals, you're not allowed to screen or archive elsewhere. So I do get a lot of frustration from feminist filmmakers, ironically. They're not happy about the fact, but they are navigating this whole space, this very contested space, and they're asking me to take off the film or the film festivals. So I just keep it unlisted because I don't want to impact their career. But it's very sad to see that something that was celebrated and had so much hope when it was broadcasted can't be archived. And actually, ironically, feminist filmmakers are telling me to take it off. Because it won't enter the competition for higher funding or recognition. So I had just a few cases like that, but in general, mostly I receive a lot of female-centered films that are happy to be archived, and so that's a different way of archiving and accessing.
Yeah.
We have another question from Sultan. Are telling stories and reimagining might be complementary parts of incompleteness of art creation or unfinished projects? That's for Helen. Helen, this is a question for you from Sultan.
Yeah. Yes. Yes, because I think there's we tell stories all the time. Every time a story is retold, it's reimagined to some extent, unless it's read word for word. So
Even then, right?
yeah.
Like as in depending on tone or like delivery or whatever.
Yes, yeah. And so we resurrect memories at different times in different places for different purposes. And so I think reimagining. I think I would go so far as to say everything is unfinished in terms of what of our stories and how we imagine things.
Especially if it's art is communicative, and communal. Yeah.
Yeah, because
exactly.
in any case, it's not complete. It's retold when somebody reimagines it as they look at it and watch it or touch it or whatever.
Yeah, I would also add to that and say that like it's told or retold in a different context for different forms of reception. So
Right,
yeah.
it's heard differently, received differently as well, which is another way
Yes.
it multiplies. Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I remember also, Alix, in your book, you mentioned that it's not just the incomplete film. it's also a woman's history, and women are also incomplete in terms of how they're understood in society. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I also got. So I think overall, like, women's stories, the way they have been told, and women's history, they are unfinished themselves, and hence the projects that they deal with.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a certain degree to which we're interested in what anthropologists have talked about as like the kind of various forms of incompletion that shape everyday life, which again, narrative is a thing that we apply to life. And to give it shape, it's really important, actually. But life does not unfold as a narrative. It unfolds in a much more amorphous, ongoing, processual kind of way. Again, and actually, I will say, I mean, we've talked a lot about narrative in this conversation, but a number of the filmmakers, feminist filmmakers that we discuss in this book are not actually interested in narrative that much. They're interested in what other things you can do with film form as well. I've been working a little bit, I'm looking forward to doing a bit more work with a fabulous film scholar and filmmaker called Karen Perlman, who contributed a chapter in the book on Shirley Clarke, who is an experimental American filmmaker who has this enormous body of almost unwatchable video art that was not really intended for any kind of exhibition. It was a form of play and experimentation. I'm very interested in those kinds of forms that are sort of working against the imperative to display, to exhibit, to that kind of thing is really interesting as well. But could you remind me, sorry, what was the question that you asked? Sorry, Samita, I've just lost the train.
Oh, it wasn't a question. It was more of a reflection on your book. And
oh, yes, about that. Yeah, totally. So I think there's ways in which, like, we're all kind of obviously in these processes of becoming, which is how anthropologists have talked about it. And that is something that we can see reflected in certain ways in unfinished film objects, including those that are deliberately unfinished or that are not trying to be finished.
Yeah.
But we very much see that the process or the project, I suppose, of feminist film history is very much unfinished. And I think we all lament actually the ways that my friend Maggie Hennefield has talked about it as the parallel tracks of film studies, where you have like regular film studies and feminist film studies. And she says we need work that can jump the parallel tracks, and that have a thoroughgoing recontextualization, reimagining from the bottom up, basically, of film studies generally, so that you don't just replicate the same kinds of stories about the past. So I think in that sense, we do see this as very much an intervention in trying to say there's been so much incredible feminist work. We are building on something that's already been ongoing for many, many decades. But we are reaching towards, as you say, a future where things could be otherwise, where we don't have to lament over and over again the ways that women and other marginalized people are dismissed or devalued or underappreciated or underemphasized in our understandings of the past.
Yeah, and I would always proudly refer to your book, Alix, as a part of celebrating the ongoing process. We do have some final thoughts and comments here, and it's from Elisenda, and I'll read them out. So she says, I was considering finished but unachieved careers, as happened with Tippi Hedren, whose future cut off by Hitchcock's influence. She has a couple of more comments here. And I was wondering, case of moving careers from big screen to television or from Hollywood to Europe. And I would like to hear your opinion. And she says, many thanks. Any thoughts?
Yes, thank you so much. Your project. So she says above that she's researching biographies of classic, sorry, I'm assuming it's she, sorry if that's not your pronouns, but classic Hollywood actresses and sexual abuse. Fascinating topic. I yes, absolutely. Unfinished film careers. It would be an amazing application and expansion of this project for sure. I will just highlight my friend Catherine Fusco's chapter, which is the last main chapter of the book, which is about the unfinished film image, star image of Marilyn Monroe through deepfakes, CGIs, and the sort of ongoing afterlife of these kinds of figures whose lives have been cut short or her careers have been cut short. In fact, the whole last section of the book is about various film stars, actresses, directors whose lives were cut short through premature death or other factors, well, premature death in all cases in those through all sorts of tragic circumstances. So thinking about these kind of the way that a career can get ended, but as you say as well, not just through death, but through actually active sabotage or through the kind of machinations of power within Hollywood or other spaces. So I think I don't have an answer for you. I would love to see what you do with this question, Alessandra. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, it's a fascinating research topic. She's doing her PhD, I believe. And yeah, this is something to continue exploring. And today we're missing Ian. I know he has so much to say. With unproduced screenplay while he is completing so many successful short films. So maybe we're going to have a conversation with him later. I know he's teaching today. He had an urgent call. But yeah, I mean, there's so much to, discuss. Any final thoughts or question as we wrap up today? We have a thought from Diana. Process of becoming fits the feminine experience, and Elisenda also says amazing, and she'll absolutely read what you recommended.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to Samita. Thank you so much, Helen, and to everyone who's joined us today as well. I feel so honoured to have had this conversation. As I said at the start, I'm completely obsessed with the unfinished. So I'm delighted to have some new acolytes to my cause. But I do think, because I just think there's so much work to be done. So if you are someone who is a filmmaker or a researcher or a writer, please, I would encourage you to see what the archives have for us. I think we've barely scratched the surface, honestly, especially in terms of women's production, not just in film, but across all mediums. There's so much work to be done. And that could be scholarly work, research, but it could also be research-led practice too. So I think there's so much opportunity to go back to the archives and to think through how we can reimagine and recontextualize unproduced or unfinished works from the past, opening onto their conditions of non-possibility and possibility, and creating new futures as well. So I just want to say thank you so much, everyone. It's been a real honor to be here today.
Yeah, and we will continue this topic on November 17th. We do have a filmmaker coming in, and just like my first film, this filmmaker, her name is Sarah Lamberg, and she completed a feature film, and she screened it in Australia, and the topic is based on incompleteness. It's how she took the idea of incompleteness and she turned it into a film, and she has been screening. So she couldn't join us today because she has a public talk somewhere, but she is speaking for us on November 17th, same time, and I will be screening her work. And so yeah, this conversation will continue. And we have one last question from Diana, and she says, she asked, do you see digitization as an important part of archiving? And yes, hope we have more conversations soon. I believe so. Helen, Alix, what would you say? Do you see digitization as an important part of archiving?
Yes, definitely. But it's just not straightforward how that works out in practice, and so the same differentials of kind of value will shape what gets digitized and what doesn't. It's also not, resource neutral as well. So it's like important to get right, I think. But it's a feminist practice actually is to archive. And so I think, and definitely a lot of feminist scholars have done an amazing job of kind of setting up new archives that are primarily digital archives, and creating whole new visions of the past. So yes, I absolutely do think it's important.
Yeah, and just like the artistic project, I feel this is also co-creative, collaborative. So I think each one of us can take responsibility, or at least have a say on this, and mobilize the process. Sultan from Film and Star Studies says, thanks for the inspiring event. And also Diana says, thank you for Thank you all for great conversations. And Elisenda says, congratulations for the book. And so happy to celebrate today, and looking forward to the ongoing progress of the book and the readership, Alix.
Thank you. Thanks very much, both.
And I hate to say goodbye. It has been over an hour, I believe. Time flew. But I'm sure, we're all going to be in touch, and your book is continued to progress, and it has a huge success, and I'm very thankful for everybody joining us today. And I wish you all a fantastic weekend.
Thank you, Sumita.
Thank you. Thanks.
And I'll see you next time.
Yeah. Bye.